Bienvenidas, bienvenidos a un nuevo ciclo de Texto y Contexto. Luego de la exitosa experiencia que compartimos en el año 2020, hemos decidido desde la Fundación BAMA de Educación y Cultura, con el acompañamiento de la Escuela Internacional para el Estudio del Holocausto de Yad Vashem y la Claims Conference, crear y desarrollar un nuevo ciclo de encuentros que apuntan a capacitar y brindar herramientas a los docentes que creen en nuestros espacios de formación. Esta propuesta está impulsada por los programas que desde Fundación BAMA hace más de 10 años forman a jóvenes y adultos educadores en los temas de Shoah, tanto Masvirim como Morey Morim. Para este encuentro abordaremos la temática del holocausto de los judíos soviéticos y los territorios anexados. El título de la conferencia es No hay nada más trágico que el destino de mi pueblo, a cargo de Orit Margaliot, directora del Departamento de Guías de la Escuela Internacional para el Estudio del Holocausto de Yad Vashem. Todo el ciclo tendrá traducción simultánea, con lo cual deben mantenerse en el canal de español. Lo pueden encontrar abajo de su sesión de Zoom, donde dice Interpretación, seleccionar el canal español. Le paso la palabra a mi colega Leticia Barán.
Hola, Brujima Baim, bienvenidos a todos. Es un gusto reencontrarnos nuevamente hoy. Les damos la bienvenida y les contamos para vuestra tranquilidad y los que no puedan participar que estas sesiones quedarán disponibles en el canal de YouTube de la Fundación BAMA. Queremos agradecer hoy la presencia de educadores de diferentes ámbitos públicos y privados, de diferentes países y de diferentes puntos del país. Hoy contamos con la presencia de educadores del ámbito formal y no formal, de Uruguay, de Paraguay, de Brasil, de República Dominicana, de México, de Venezuela, de Colombia, de Perú, de Bolivia, de Chile, de República Checa, de Israel, y seguramente de algún otro país que hoy no mencioné y pedimos disculpas de antemano por eso. Les doy entonces una calurosa bienvenida y le voy a dar la palabra a Gaby Glassman, representante regional de la Agencia Judía para Israel y de la Organización Sionista Mundial para el Cono Sur. Adelante, Gaby.
Bueno, hola, gracias Leti, gracias por invitarme a compartir este momento con ustedes. Y voy a ser breve porque me parece que estamos aquí para escuchar a Orit y eso es lo importante y aprender de ella. Pero cuando hoy a la mañana estaba pensando, me acordaba que tenía este evento que quería participar y estuve pensando qué quería transmitir en 2 minutos y no sé si tuve la suerte o la casualidad, pero hoy me senté a leer los resultados de un estudio que últimamente hicimos desde la Organización Sionista Mundial y la Agencia Judía sobre antisemitismo en jóvenes de Chile. Y todavía, recién ahora estamos tratando de entender qué es lo que aprendimos de este estudio, y son casi 70 páginas, muy interesante, pero hay algo que me está haciendo mucho ruido desde la mañana, y me lo dejé al lado, que en realidad lo tengo aquí, y que en realidad la pregunta es muy fácil, ¿no? Que hacemos una pregunta que nos hacemos todos los que estamos trabajando en educación y que hablamos sobre Shoah, y la pregunta era, ¿algo como el Holocausto podría volver a ocurrir hoy? Yo sin mirar pensé que la mayoría iba a contestar que no, pero solo el 49% piensa que esto no puede pasar otra vez. Después se divide algo de desacuerdo, muy de desacuerdo, pero para mí esto es preocupante, y si digo, ¿por qué seguir estudiando? ¿Por qué seguir analizando? ¿Por qué seguir profundizando? Es exactamente por esa respuesta que solo un 49% nos contesta que están totalmente de acuerdo que esto no podría volver a pasar. Y este es el legado que yo tengo, seguir aprendiendo de diferentes ángulos, para diferentes públicos, y cuanto más mejor. Y desde ese lugar agradezco a la gente de BAMA, a la gente de Yad Vashem, al Claims, a todos los que están involucrados por permitirnos seguir aprendiendo y profundizando. Me voy a sumar hoy, si me permiten, escuchar con ustedes y aprender, y seguir encontrando nuevos caminos, porque aquí tenemos todavía un camino largo de seguir haciendo, no solo de preservar la memoria, pero realmente para estudiar, porque esto no puede llegar a pasar otra vez. Y nosotros somos parte de esa capacidad de que las cosas tengamos todos un futuro mejor. No quiero extenderme, pero que no le pase no solo a nosotros, a ningún pueblo. Gracias por darme esta oportunidad. Bueno, yo me muteo y aprendo como todos. Gracias.
Gracias, Gaby. Toda rabá. Le paso entonces la palabra ahora a Eliana Rav-Vadihi, en nombre de la Escuela Internacional de Yad Vashem, para que ella sí se presente a Yehiel y a nuestra oradora tan especial que tenemos el día de hoy.
Gracias, Leti. Es un placer para mí estar acá hoy en este segundo encuentro de texto y contexto, como parte de las actividades que estamos realizando abiertas a todo el público y también, por supuesto, a nuestros graduados de Morei Morim de todos estos años. Quiero, en primer lugar, en nombre de Yad Vashem, de la señora Perla Hassan, directora para América Latina, España, Portugal y Miami, del Departamento de Relaciones Exteriores de Yad Vashem, en nombre, por supuesto, también de Yehiel Chilevsky, coordinador educativo de nuestro equipo, los programas para habla hispana y portuguesa, agradecerles este trabajo conjunto con BAMA, y también, por supuesto, con la agencia judía, con la Sochnut, de tantos años. Agradecer a Jimena, directora de BAMA, a Leticia Barán y a Eureka Kovacic, coordinadoras del proyecto Morei Morim, a Vale Levin de Masverim Argentina. Tenemos muchos proyectos en conjunto y esto habla de un gran trabajo y gran esfuerzo. A todo el equipo de BAMA, a Denise, al equipo técnico y por supuesto también a Cintia, que nos va a traducir en el día de hoy. Un agradecimiento especial a Gaby Glassman por estar aquí hoy presentes. Es muy importante el apoyo, así que desde ya muchísimas gracias. Y por supuesto, en primer lugar, gracias a Orit Margaliot, que realmente quien dirige, como dijiste, el departamento de los guías de Yad Vashem, que es una persona que sabe muchísimo, ahora la voy a presentar, pero gracias por estar acá hoy. Es muy importante para nosotros que estés acá. Bien, este año, como ustedes saben, marca el 80 aniversario de la invasión a la Unión Soviética y el inicio del asesinato masivo de judíos. El 22 de junio de 1941 se percibe como un punto de inflexión en la historia de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y el Holocausto, la Shoah. La conferencia presentará y establecerá el aspecto ideológico de la guerra contra la Unión Soviética y tratará sobre quiénes eran los judíos de la Unión Soviética, cuál fue el destino de los aproximadamente 2.700.000 judíos, desde 2,7 puntos judíos hasta 5 millones que se encontraron bajo la ocupación germano-nazi, qué opciones de supervivencia tenían estos judíos y los desafíos que ellos tuvieron que afrontar en este periodo. Orit Margaliot, nuestra conferencista en el día de hoy, estudió Historia del Arte e Historia del Holocausto en la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén. Ha trabajado en la Escuela Internacional para el Estudio del Holocausto de Yad Vashem desde el año 2000 y ha sido responsable de las oficinas y de las capacitaciones de varios países en el Departamento de Europa y Australia. Durante 13 años fue jefa de la oficina de Polonia en el Departamento de Europa. Orit estuvo a cargo del desarrollo educativo del bloque 27 en el Museo Auschwitz-Birkenau. En los últimos 7 años fue jefa de capacitación y desarrollo de planes de estudio de guías en el Departamento de Orientación Educativa entre el personal del curso de orientación para guías israelíes de Polonia en Yad Vashem, de cual yo también fui alumna de Orit, así que un orgullo estar acá y que estés aquí. Orit es profesora de Historia de Arte y Literatura y actualmente es la directora del Departamento de Orientación Educativa y de Guías de la Escuela Internacional para el Estudio del Holocausto de Yad Vashem. Orit, muchísimas gracias y ahora sí, te cedo la palabra.
Thank you very much for such a nice introduction, Eliana. And I'm very happy to be here. And with your permission, I'm going to share my screen with a PowerPoint that will accompany us during this session. And I'd like to start with the title of this lecture, which is a quote from a Jewish soldier in the Soviet army who said, "There's nothing more tragic than my people's fate." And we'll come back to this letter towards the end of my presentation, but I want you to have this in mind to understand the paradox that he presents here in this quote. And when we want to speak about the Holocaust of the Soviet Jewry, actually in a nutshell, I'd like to present through the story of one family that you can see the testimony pages here in front of you, bringing everything that I'm going to elaborate later. So if you understand this in the next 4 minutes, I can actually finish, but conclude by that and move on. But I'll start with this personal story of the Karas family, who were from Kharkov, from the Ukraine. And this family, in a way, represents the three main roots or the three main fates that Soviet Jewry found themselves during the Holocaust in World War II. So the first generation, Feige and her daughter Dvora, were among only the 10% which remained in Kharkov under the German occupation. And Kharkov was occupied in a very late period, only in October 1941. So we're speaking 2.5 months after the invasion to the Soviet Union. And so they were among the few who remained in Kharkov and were executed nearby in a place called Drobetskaya, where approximately up to 20,000 Jews were murdered. And in this way, they represent the fate of approximately 2.5 million Soviet Jewry, Soviet Jews during this period of time. Now, we have to understand that the majority who remained under the German or Romanian rule during World War II, the vast majority were murdered. And the reason for that, and we'll elaborate this later on, is due to the proximity of the murder to the moment of invasion. If we compare this, for example, to the story of Poland, which is occupied in September 1939 with the October Act, and with the September Act. But we find the final solution implemented only if we speak of Western Poland, occupied Poland in December 1941, and in the vast majority of occupied Poland during spring of 1942 till the summer, autumn of 1943. There are approximately 2.5 years of getting along under the occupation, something the Soviet Jewry did not have. Or taking, for example, the French case. France was occupied in June 1940, but the mass deportations begin only in the summer of 1942. So this shows us one of the unique factors that we'll later on speak more about, the proximity of the murder to the time of occupation. So this is the first and second generation which represent that, which is one fate, the fate of the majority under the Nazi rule. The second fate is of these two brothers of the Karas family, Vladimir and Raphael, who enlisted to the Soviet army, and they represent in that way approximately 500,000 Jews who enlisted to the Soviet army, not always by choice, of course, as we're speaking of such a regime, but still, they take part for different initiatives of the army, and approximately 300,000 of them survived this way. By the way, this is not the case of these two brothers. Both fell in battles, one in 1942, one in 1943 next to Kursk, the one in 1942 next to Moscow, but still they represent another main fate of Soviet Jewry. And the last root, the last fate, is of this testimony page of the youngest brother, Vladik, who was 5 years old. And if you look at the date, he perished in Omsk, in the area of Siberia, of the eastern parts of the Soviet Union, in 1945. And he represents approximately the group of between 1.2 million to 1.4 million Jews who were evacuated or fled on their own to the unoccupied territories of the Soviet Union, and this way survived. As you can see, not all survived because the circumstances of life, they were very difficult and harsh. So there were those who later on, due to the lack of normal conditions, perished there, but the vast majority managed to survive this way. So here in the nutshell, we can see the whole story that now I would like to elaborate what we're going to discuss in the following hour. So what are we talking about? Which sphere? And I wanted to take a look at this map because only looking at it, we understand how vast the Soviet Union was. And you can see in pink are the territories which were annexed as part of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and following that agreement between 1939 and 1940 to the Soviet Union. By the way, today is the anniversary. I don't know if this is a coincidence or deliberate that you chose this date, but August 23rd is the date of the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. So it worked well for this lecture. So we can say it was actually deliberate, right? And even if it wasn't. But in any case, following the agreement of the non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, following that, we will find all these territories which were annexed to the Soviet Union. But in general, you can see it's a very small part, and the Soviet Union was very vast. Moreover, this is the only country during World War II in Europe that wasn't fully occupied. And even more than that, that more than half of it was not occupied, which also enabled another way of survival because approximately 700,000 Jews remained in their homes. Like there were other citizens of the Soviet Union because they were never occupied. The war didn't reach them because of the front ending and were starting to retreat from the end of the winter of 1941 into the beginning of the winter of 1942. But this map also illustrates another very important issue that I would like also to set ground for before we continue into the history in the details. And that is, when we say Soviet Jewry, who are we speaking about? One of the important scholars of the Holocaust of Soviet Jewry who passed away this year was Dr. Yitzhak Arad, who was also the chairman of Yad Vashem for 21 years. And he was a partisan, a child partisan. He fought also in the IDF here in Israel. And after he retired from his position as the chairman of Yad Vashem, he dedicated another 20 plus years to research the story of the Holocaust of the Soviet Jewry. And one of the questions he faced, and 2 volumes came out of the history of that Holocaust that he edited and brought together. The question was, of which Jews are we speaking? Are we speaking of the Jews of the Soviet Union according to the borders of 1939, of the authentic Soviet Union? Or are we speaking according to the borders of June 1941, according to what the Germans will invade? And his answer was, and this is why he altered the name of the volumes. They are not titled The Holocaust of the Soviet Union merely, but The Holocaust of the Soviet Union and the Annexed Territories, because he said we have to follow the German definition. Because once the German invaded the Soviet Union, it doesn't matter if it was a Jew who was before under Polish rule and from 1939 was under the Soviet, or if it was someone who lived in Leningrad for that matter, even if it was only under siege, which was originally a part of the Soviet Union. And this is why this is also the definition that we're going to follow through this lecture, but which was defined by him at first. So before we speak of the Holocaust of Soviet Jewry, we have to speak who are these Jews. And I'd like again to lay a couple of basic facts to understand later on, if we want to speak of their response and what happens to them, we have to know first who they were. And I'm sure you're also acquainted with the educational philosophy of Yad Vashem in this way, that first we have to know what we're speaking about before they're victims, to understand who are these people. And one of the things that you can see here, which is very important, is the fact that the Soviet Union was the last country which emancipated their Jews in Europe. They were the last to be emancipated in 1917 with the Bolshevist revolution that started in 1917, was completed later on by the early 20s. But this is acute, because this, for the first time, opened the doors for the Jews to leave the Pale of Settlement, where they were confined from the end of the 18th century, which were areas of poverty and of villages, and they can move to the new and big cities. And this opened new opportunities for them. Now, this inner migration is very important because it, of course, applies also for other populations in the Soviet Union. And we're speaking of a multi-ethnical country. This is something very important. You cannot say Russians, we have to speak about Soviets, because you have here a correlation, a world that brings together different ethnicities together under one state. And when we speak about the Jews, what we can see here is, first of all, a rapid urbanization process the Jews go through. And you can see from the numbers here how clear that is. You can see that by 1939, in Moscow, approximately 250,000 Jews lived. And you can see that in Leningrad, approximately 200,000, and in Kiev, approximately 150,000, in Odessa, 200,000, and Kharkov, which we started the story of the Karas family with, approximately 130,000. So this is very important, because this shows us also something that affects the way of life of Jews when we come to speak about 1939 or 1941. The second thing is that we can see is to what extent the Jews integrated in all life systems in the Soviet state. You can see an example for that if you look at the illustration over here to the right. And this is, you can see his name here is Iona Yakil, but much more known as Yakov Shmushkevich, who was the high commander of the Soviet Air Force. But you can see the photo to the left, how rapid the change he went through, because you can see that his parents represent the Orthodox, the traditional Jew. And this is part of the rapid process that we can see that occurs in a period of 20 years only, which is acute. Or for example, you can see here, Yuri Levitan, who is known as the head narrator of the Moscow radio, and he was known as the voice of Moscow. He will be the one who will announce all the key moments in the Soviet Union. The invasion of Germany to the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, the victory of the war on May 9th, 1945, the end of the war and the surrender of Germany. He will be the one who will announce when Stalin will die in 1953, and so on. So he is a representation for that. And again, it shows us how Jews find their way into the army, into politics, into culture, and very much influenced from there. Another thing that is strongly connected to that is that you can see that the Jews is the most educated group of all the ethnic groups in the Soviet Union. They represent 13% in total of the students in universities, while in practice they represent less than 2% from the general population. So this also, of course, opens doors to them and puts them in key positions. And we can speak, of course, also of a acculturation of the Jews, and that means that we will find them integrated culturally, but not necessarily in conversion. This is also something that's important if you compare it, for example, to Germany, where you can find a different Jewish development or integration in society into fully assimilation. The last thing that you can see is the important number, and that is that in 1939, on the eve of the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which we mark today, there were approximately 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union. Okay, so this is the number we're speaking of in 1939. Just to end, one more thing, which is important to remember, where I spoke about the key positions of the Jews, and of course, this is a whole different lecture on its own, but look at Shmushkevich at the year that he died, 1937, because this is part of the purification wave by Stalin of getting rid of all those that he perceived as opposers. And since Jews had key positions, both in the NKVD, as well as the secret police, as well in different places, many find themselves, like others, but in higher proportions, murdered by Stalin in the wave of these purification waves in 1937, between 1936, 7, and 8. Okay. And then on August 23rd, 1939, this agreement is signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, something that is important that we don't necessarily think over, we say, yeah, they received part of Poland. They did not receive just part of Poland in that secret agreement of the non-aggression agreement. They received 51% of Poland, okay? It's not 1/3, it's more than half. Now you can see it vividly here on this map. Now, of course, this creates a question, how do the Jews react to the entry of the Soviets? Because what happens is, if you remember, the World War II breaks on September 1st, 1939. And due to this agreement, by September 17th, the Germans retreat from the areas which were destined to be under the Soviets, and the Soviets enter. And the question is, what is the response and how does this affect the Jews? So we're speaking about approximately 2.1 million Jews in the annexed territories altogether. Now I want you first to look at this lower map because it shows us the annexation process, or if you want, in the more correct phrase, in the occupying territories, because they annexed, but it was actually occupied in the local terminology. We have to remember that. So we have 51% of Poland. Later on in 1940, by June 1940, they will enter also Lithuania, Latvia, and also later on will reach Estonia. So this is something very important in understanding that in all of these territories, altogether, there are approximately 2.1 million Jews. Now, what is the Jewish response to this? So first of all, many claimed, since they saw the German rule, it's better to be under Stalin rather than under Hitler. You can see the quote here in yellow, which says, life sentence is better than an immediate death. Because they saw what happened to Jews under Germans, a German occupation. Stalin can be worse, probably better, even if it's like a life sentence. Another thing that happens, and we have to remember, there were Jews who were communist. Communism was outlawed in interwar Poland, and some of them were also socialists. And the fact that if they were, even if though they were communists or socialists, and again, not necessarily the majority, but we can still think of a profound group. What is interesting, they never knew what was really going inside the Soviet Union. So it might have been very appealing that there is an equality and everybody receives jobs and you have a known income that you will receive monthly, but they didn't know exactly what was going on. So this also many times created a support, at least by some, of the Soviet regime. What will happen very rapidly is that Soviet regime will implement what they have done in the last 20 years in the Soviet Union in a few months and will alter the economy, education, and politics. And they will outlaw many groups because of that, as they were outlawed also in the Soviet Union till 1939. We will find also huge waves of punishment and deportation from the annexed territories to Siberia. And it's interesting to see when you look at narrations. For example, Polish narration will speak about the harsh deportation, and that will be that. While Jews, by facto, this will be their way of rescue. Even if they will find themselves in gulags in Siberia, de facto, this will be the way of their survival. So we have to bear that in mind as well. So we can't tell the story from the end of it, which is maybe our greatest challenge when we tell the story of the Holocaust and we try to teach it, because we know the end of the story, they of course didn't. But still, de facto, this was a way of survival. But because of this support, and even if it was a support because it was better to be under Stalin rather than under Hitler, this created a very negative image of theirs in the eyes of their neighbors. What was known as the Żydo Komuna. Żydo Komuna, the Jews are supporters of the communist regime, And therefore, they actually are stabbing, our neighbors are stabbing us in the back because they are actually not supporting the nation they were supposed to be part of. And remember that because this also has implementation later on under the occupation. So when we're speaking about numbers, because we want to come to the turning point, of course, of June 22nd, 1941, what are we talking about? So we said that in general, in the old Soviet Union, there were approximately 3 million Jews. Add to them from the next territories, approximately 2.1 million Jews, but only approximately 2.7 million will remain under the occupation, Romanian or German, okay? So where did the Jews find themselves during the war? So as we mentioned through, and we saw through the Karas family, approximately 500,000 will enlist to the Soviet army. Between 1.2 to 1.4 million will be evacuated officially or will flee on their own into the unoccupied territories of the Soviet Union. And you can see here in the illustration above, you can see the children here being evacuated. And remember the map that all of these parts remain unoccupied. So if they manage, either they are evacuated by the regime, by the government, in order to, for the war effort and so on, or they flee on their own. And it all depends on their possibility of flight and evacuation to how close to the border they are. For example, once the invasion to the Soviet Union will happen on June 22nd, 1941. Take, for example, Lithuania. Vilnius and Kovno were occupied already by the 24th of June. So maybe 22% maybe managed to escape. So the proximity to the border, of course, had great implementation regarding the possibilities Jews and the general population had. And as we mentioned also at the beginning, approximately 700,000 Jews remained in the unoccupied territories of the Soviet Union. So let's understand why is Operation Barbarossa so important in the Nazi odds? Why is this a huge turn in the development of World War II from the German aspect? And the reason is, first of all, you can see by the name of this operation. Operation Barbarossa, Barbarossa of the Red Beard. This is named after Friedrich from the First Reich, from the Middle Ages, because this is a war, it's us or them. The ideological factor here will become acute. There was an ideological factor already when we speak of the occupation of Poland, but it's definitely not the same here. And how can we see that? It's due to the fact that the Soviet Union is perceived as the total opposite of National Socialism, of Nazi Germany. And therefore, everything in this war is perceived differently. This as a whole, and forget the Jews, put the Jews aside for a moment. This whole territory is perceived as a hostile territory. And therefore, you have to annihilate all in order to build the new, to create the new. If you want to understand to what extreme measurements this means, look, for example, in France, where you had a puppet government of Vichy, which existed, at least in half of France. Or places that you can find that countries received their own government under the German wing, German Nazi wing. This is impossible here due to the ideological factor. And this hostility that is perceived to this territory, and therefore the total perceivement of annihilation is acute to understand what happens here, because we're speaking all together in these territories, approximately 26 million people will be killed and murdered by Nazi Germany. 13 million of them will be soldiers, and the rest are civilians. So even if we take the number of Jews of approximately 2.7 million, right? which find themselves under the Nazi and Romanian occupation, this is a very minor number of the victims of the general number of civilian victims in the Soviet Union and occupied territories. Another thing that is important here, that this is perceived, and this is Plan Ost, if you've heard of it, this is perceived as a colonial territory. If you are acquainted with Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, which speaks about this whole territory as a colonial territory, and therefore a genocidal aspect which is implemented in different ways, this is exactly this idea. Now, if it's a colonial territory, where you are supposed to expand for the Aryan race, that they will have Lebensraum, they'll have a territory of living. The concept here is that you should, and it's your right to exploit all natural treasures and human resource for your use. Now, this concept of also how do you treat the people is implemented in the fact that soldiers are told before the invasion to the Soviet Union on June 22nd, they are told that they will not be found accountable for wars, for war criminals' actions, meaning everything is allowed. And this will enable also different steps being taken. Now, as part of Plan Ost, the concept is also you have millions of people, new millions of people under your occupation. What will you do with them? So a plan of mass starvation to reduce the number of mouths that you'll have to feed is also part of this genocidal and annihilation territory which should be implemented. Saying that, what is the role of the Jew in this whole perceivement? And for the first time, you can see here the quote by Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda and Culture in Nazi Germany. This is the first time that we find that the Jew is the reasoning for the war. And this is what he says on June 22nd, 1941. Now is the hour to an essential act against this plot of the Anglo-Saxon Jewish initiators of the war and their leaders, the Jewish Bolsheviks in Moscow. This is the first time we can see how Jews are perceived as the reasoning of the war itself. We do not find it before, not stated very clearly. Now, so what is between the fate of the general population under occupation and the Jews? Professor Christopher Browning, in maybe one of his most important books regarding this issue, The Origins of the Final Solution, the development of the Nazi policy against the Jews between 1939 and 1942, he speaks of the following. Now mass executions, mass expulsions, and mass starvation were being planned for the Soviet Union within the framework of a war of destruction through some unspecified combination of execution, starvation, and expulsion to inhospitable territories. Soviet Jewry, along with millions of other Slavs, would eventually be destroyed. Every time people were shot in large scales, the number of Jews who were shot was subsequently larger than their percentage in the population. When mass expulsions and starvations were planned, the intent was not to leave Jews behind. And wherever the food was scarce, the Jews were the first to starve. So this gives us the understanding that the Jewish situation will be much more extreme than the general population in the harsh general situation of this territory, okay? So let's try and understand what happens with this invasion. Prior to the invasion, we know of the establishment of 4 mobile killing units known as the Einsatzgruppen, consisted altogether of maybe 3,000 people, which they have one task, and I apologize that that map here is in Hebrew, but the geography is much more important than the illustration, so I'm sure you're finding your way. And you can see here the 4 arrowheads of the invasion to the Soviet Union, and following each arrowhead was also one Einsatzgruppe following, one of those mobile cooling units. We have to remember that with the invasion to the Soviet Union, which caught the Soviet army by surprise. And also with problems of manpower due to the annihilation waves by Stalin the previous years, which definitely affected the state of the Soviet Union. What we can see is that they start with the murder of Jewish men, along with commissars and political figures. But still, the policy of annihilation is of those who are threatening the safety of the territory under the occupation. When is the turning point? The turning point is what happens on July 16th, a few weeks after the invasion. And we have the protocol from Hitler's meeting describing what happens at this point that will alter and will put everything in a different tempo. And this is what we know from the protocol of that meeting. It is important now not to reveal our goals to the whole world. We will stress that we were forced to occupy the area and put order and security in it. Now, what he says is a justification. The Russians have just issued an order of a partisans' war in our home front. The partisans' war has also an advantage. It enables us to annihilate all those who oppose us. What he does here, he phrases the justification to have a free reign to do whatever you want in these territories without being accountable. Because if this is a partisans' war, we are actually protecting ourselves. Now, looking back at this timeline, what we can see here is that following this July 16th, we will find more German forces being sent to enlarge the Eisenskuppen, the mobile killing units, and they will triple and will be up to 11,000 in a few weeks in order to implement the mass killing that will be developed at this point. From the first month of mass murder of murdering only Jewish men into expanding it to what we know as the Holocaust of Soviet Jewry of also murdering women and children. Now, one of the things that we learn, that we know today, and also Christopher Browning in his research of ordinary men is very important in this, that he researched, is the fact that first of all, we cannot speak only of SS troops taking part in the Eisenskuppen and in the implementation of the murder, but we're speaking also of order police, German order police, as well as the Wehrmacht, as the German army. Now, till the end of 1941, the vast majority of the perpetrators were Germans, and the minority were locals. In 1942, this will flip over 180 degrees due to the fact that they will need the Germans more in the front. And so the role of the local collaborators and perpetrators will rise, okay? So this is also something important in the understanding of also who perpetuated the murder and how it happens. The second thing that we can see here is we have to be very careful to put our prejudice aside. And when I say prejudice, is that I'm saying it with, of course, with quotations, but I mean in the matter that many times we try to explain why things happen by anti-Semitism or other equal explanations. But it's not always correct. For example, the mass murder, the total mass murder started in Lithuania. Not because the Lithuanians were all great anti-Semites and perpetuated the murder, but because Eisenskuppen was stuck. The front was stuck. So they had to find a way to occupy the time of the soldiers. So they started there to issue the final solution. So we have to be very careful. And I'm saying that as educators, because it's very easy to fall into these places because of the way or that we're educated or because of lack of knowledge, but it works well. So we have to be very attentive and to check historical facts constantly that we don't fall into these places. Now, what pushes one step forward, the issue of the final solution is what happens in August 1941. In August 1941, Stalin decides to deport to Siberia all those of German ethnicity. The most known part is of the Volga Germans, but not merely. And because of that, Hitler will come and say, you are harming my people? Okay, I'm going to deport Jews from the Reich to the occupied Soviet Union territories, and they will be murdered there. And here lays another unique factor of the final solution, which is implemented in the Soviet occupied territory. And that is not only Soviet Jews are being murdered there, but Jews from the Reich as well, due to the justification and the perceivement of this area ideologically, okay? So this is another important point, and we will find these deportations from the Reich. We will find them implemented from October 1941 onwards. And this is why, for example, Minsk ghetto, which I don't know how much you are familiar with it, but it's the third ghetto, largest ghetto under the rule of the Nazis. Approximately 100,000 people were there, had two ghettos. The German ghetto, which were the Jews from the Reich, and the local ghetto. And they were totally parted. They had no connections between them, okay? So this exemplifies to what extent we can find what goes on in these territories. And the last point, which is crucial, and also challenges us due to the way we were raised, is the methods of murder, as well as the fact that the murder of Soviet Jewry initiated on June 1941, and it will continue till the end of the occupation of these territories till 1944. Throughout the whole time, we will find waves of annihilation, and with a multiple system of murder. What do I mean? We were taught that the first phase was also we know from Father de Bois, the way he coined it, that we're speaking of the Holocaust in bullets. And then it developed to the murder through the gas trucks, for example, Chemno, to Reinhard camps and Auschwitz. But this is not correct. Every time in the method of murder, they will never stop the previous method, but they will only add another. And just to exemplify this in the Soviet territories which were occupied, we will find in Minsk, Jews being murdered simultaneously in Mali Trostinets and in Minsk itself, in the streets, by bullets, by gas trucks. And in 1943, they will send those who were left to Sobibor to be murdered in the gas chambers, okay? So it's very important. We have the need as people, as human beings, to have a linear development. But the Holocaust is mostly of chaos. And this is maybe also one of our greatest challenges, not only towards ourselves, but also how do we mediate it to our students? And it's not an easy task because we think always in patterns, in stages, but there are no stages here in that way, okay? Okay, and I would like to elaborate now a little more about these different issues. The first thing you can see, the ideological factor, how is also they try to persuade the local population how the Jews are the seed of all evil and why they should be eradicated totally. You can see to the left, and you can see it's in Russian. So this is propaganda for the locals. This is not for the Germans. You can see how it says 26 years of Jewish burden on Russia, Red Army soldier follow the Jew. You can see here the Žid, and to the left you can see the same Yuri Levitan, who is titled The Židic Truth of Levitan. So this is all colored, right? It's not, you do not get facts from the Jews. The Jews have an agenda, and this is a struggle for life or death. Now let's try and understand here the different stages, because still we can speak of stages regarding the way of implementation of the final solution and the fate of the Jews in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. So the first phase that we can speak of is what you can see here, that we're speaking from the invasion, the first phase, the first stage of annihilation, from the invasion in June 22nd, 1941, till the winter of 1941-42. We're speaking of mass murder in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and in the old Soviet Union territories which were occupied. Approximately 800,000 Jews were murdered. This is in 6 months. Okay, so to understand how well it works, okay, the system. Now what happens is, why do we speak this is the first stage? Why aren't everyone being murdered? Because remember that Germany is, Nazi Germany cannot proceed. They find themselves stopped because of the winter, because of the Soviet response, and therefore they need working hands. So only after the initial murder of approximately 800,000 Jews, the ghettos are established. Now, we will find the ghettos mostly for the war effort. And this you can see either in the territories which were annexed in 1939, for example, Vilnius ghetto, Kovno ghetto, the fact that these are all ghettos which have a working function, or even if you speak of those in the old Soviet Union territories. Now, what happens between the second wave of annihilation is between the spring of 1942 and the winter of 1942-43, and that is the annihilation of the small ghettos. Now, remember that here, the proportions of the perpetrators had changed, that the majority will be locals led by Germans, but most of the German troops will be taken to the front in order to take part in the Great War against this great ideological menace. And the third phase that we will speak of is of between the summer of 1943 and the summer of 94, which will end the occupation of these territories, which will be the annihilation of the last Jews in all of these places. If you are familiar, for example, one of the camps which opens the exhibition at Yad Vashem museum is the story of Kluga camp in Estonia, where there were approximately 2,000 inmates, majority of them were Jews. When the Germans understand that they have to retreat, they murder all the inmates. So there will be no traces behind. Now this concept of erasing traces, so no one will know what has happened and there will be no one to testify, this is why already this was initiated in the summer of 1942 by the establishment of Einsatzkommando 1005. That they have one purpose, because Germany is starting to retreat by the spring of 1942, every place this commando comes to, they reopen the mass graves and they burn the bodies. So there will be no evidence to what has happened in this place. Holocaust denial started by Nazi Germany during the Holocaust, because they understood that people will not comprehend and accept what they have done. So they wanted to erase any testimony to the murder. Another thing that is important here to mention, we spoke about the fact that the majority of perpetrators by this point, in proportions, were locals. The question is, why would the locals take part? Now, again, we have the tendency of automatically say anti-Semitism, but actually, this is incorrect. Because remember that this is a very harsh occupation with sieges and blockades on people which are being taken to forced labor in Germany. And they're very limited. Food is scarce in many places. Now, according to the research of Alexander Prusin, who passed away also a year and a half ago, he speaks, and he mostly researched the Ukraine, but still he proves in his research that the main motivation to perpetuate in the murder was not ideological, was not anti-Semitism, but the economical factor. And what he shows in the case of Ukraine, he compares the wages of the different professions. A teacher and a judge earned about 250, maybe 300 zlotys a month. But if you were a policeman, you can earn 600, 700 zlotys. Now, remember, when you are a policeman, it doesn't mean that you only murder Jews all the time. This is one thing. You might also murder others, other opposers to the regime. And also, your belief is that you want to make an income. Does it justify their acts? Definitely not. But if we want to understand how is it humanly possible, it definitely explains better the different motivations. And of course, we cannot speak of only one motivation, and they can also exist simultaneously. But the economical factor, the economical gain, is a cue to understand this issue. And what we can see, we saw before how the Jews were a justification to the invasion to the Soviet Union. Professor Shaul Friedlander, in his very important research of years of extermination, shows in the following quote in yellow how the justification of the murder of the Jews changes according to the needs of the war. And let's read this for a moment together. In the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, the murder was targeted first against the Jews as the carriers of the Soviet system, then the Jews as partisans by force, and finally as elements which live in territories which are eventually planned for a German settlement. So the justification changes, but the Jews are always the target in that way, okay? And this brings us to the discussion of what are the unique characteristics of the Holocaust of the Soviet Union Jewry. And I will repeat here a few of the things that we said before, but I do want to bring everything together in one framework here. So we spoke about the ideological factor and its importance in the initial step of Operation Barbarossa, of the need to annihilate the whole in order to rebuild anew. We spoke also, and in that we are speaking also of the Jewish factor of being seen as the representatives of the Soviet system. We spoke about the fact that the Jews are the first victims of annihilation, of mass murder, as we saw how it develops in 3 stages. And the fact that there are such high numbers of victims so close to the invasion due to the fact that there are no prior stages. As we know from other places, or by establishment of ghettos and then executing the final solution, or having confining laws and anti-Jewish policy legislated, but still people can live before they are deported to their death. Here there are no prior stages, and the proximity to the time of invasion also dictates the fate of many. We spoke about the simultaneous methods of murder throughout this whole period from June 1941 till the end of the occupation in 1944, and also killing sites that we have locally. For example, as we started with the story of the Karas family, so we spoke about Drobitskiar, of the place of the Jews of Kharkov, of those 10% which remained, who did not flee or been evacuated and found themselves under the German occupation and been murdered. We know, for example, Kiev Jews who were murdered in Babi Yar. And or, for example, when we look at Vilnius Jewry, which were murdered in Ponari, okay? We spoke about who are the perpetrators and the fact we cannot just speak, as it used to be merely of the SS, but we're speaking of SS of military government officials, of civil government participants, and of local collaborators. And here is a unique factor that you cannot find any parallel in any other occupied territory in Europe during World War II. Due to the fact of the extreme ideological measurement and perceivement of the Soviet Union, this is the only place that people of mixed blood, Mischlinge, okay, who are only partially Jews, were sentenced to death directly. If you compare it, for example, and if you remember the Wannsee Conference, its main issue of discussion was not the final solution, but when you look at the protocol, it's mostly discussing what do you do with the Mischlinge, with Jews of mixed blood. So they say maybe we'll send them to Theresienstadt, maybe to other places. They don't have a unified policy what to do with them. The only place, due to the ideological factor, that they are directly sentenced to death with the occupation is in the Soviet Union occupied territories. And this is a very unique factor. And you have to remember what we spoke before in the old Soviet Union territories of the integration of the Jews in the local population. And therefore, of course, you had many families which were intermarried. And so you had many of mixed blood. But it didn't help them, right, in that way. We spoke of another very unique factor, that people were brought from other territories, other countries to be murdered there. And this brings us to the question of which options did Jews have to survive? How could Jews survive in this period of time? And we can find a few ways. First of all, we have individuals who help, as we know from other places, different rescuers. Some of them will be acknowledged and recognized as righteous among the nations. They will apply to the definition of Yad Vashem. But in general, we have rescuers which will hide people, which will hide them or in a real hiding, or also will supply false papers to live in a false identity. But the three main maybe ways of rescue are, first, the enlistment to the Soviet army. And again, not necessarily by choice, because we have to remember this is a communist state. But in de facto, this will be a way of survival. As we mentioned before, approximately 500,000 Jews were part of the Soviet army. Approximately 300,000 survived. The other 200,000, 82,000 were murdered in POW camps, okay, in prisoners of war camps. Once they were identifying as Jews, all prisoners of war from the Soviet Union were not supposed to survive under the German, in the German POW camps, but Jews, which was much more extreme. So 82,000 were murdered in POW camps, and the rest fell in battle. So this is one very important way of survival. The second way of survival, which we mentioned also before, that between 1.2 to 1.4 million Jews fled or were officially evacuated to the unoccupied territories of the Soviet Union. And the third way of survival was of partisans. There were approximately 30,000 partisans. Now, just to put it in the wider picture, there were approximately 700,000 partisans in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. Now, we have to put it in context, right? You're titled in your seminar Text and Context. So here is the text and context. Because why is this acute? Because the partisan movement, the general partisan movement, was formed only from the beginning, mostly from the spring of 1942. By that time, approximately 1 million of the Jews were already murdered. So we have to remember, for whom is this a solution? This is one challenge. The second challenge we have to bear in mind, that most of the Jews were urbanic people. So to flee to the forest is not necessarily an possibility, because it's not enough to go to the forest. Without human aid, you cannot survive the forest. So this is another issue. Among those 30,000 Jewish partisans, 2,000 of them survived in family camps. two family camps. One is more known than the other. The first, and they were very close to each other. They were both in Belarusia and had contact between them. One was very close to Novogrodek, led by the Bielski brothers, and became very known, mostly also to the film of resistance that came out. And you can see what creates history and remembrance, right? And they rescued approximately 1,200 Jews, right? 1,200 Jews. And the other family camp nearby, which mostly rescued the Jews of Minsk, and mostly children among them, is the Shalom Zoin camp. 800 Jews, mostly children. Now, altogether, just to understand, from Minsk ghetto, 10,000 Jews escaped to the forest. Due to the full cooperation between the urban underground, the general underground, and the ghetto underground. Because of the full integration of the Jews in the society before the war. So you can see why it's so important to understand the characteristics of who are Soviet Jewry before the war, to understand also the possibilities, for example, of rescue. And so we have different forms of resistance in that way. And let's look at the numbers, because the numbers show, if you want to speak about the Holocaust, this is the sphere that represents it most than any other place. Out of 2.7 million Jews, only 4% survived. You can see how it breaks down to the different countries. But if you want to really pass to your students what is the Holocaust, this is the place. Don't take France as an example. Don't take even Belgium or the Netherlands as an example. Because in the Netherlands, you have 25% to survive. Go to these places, because it represents also in the parts which were under the Romanian rule, right? Moldavia and parts of the Ukraine. But it represents, in a nutshell, what is the Holocaust and our greatest challenge, because we're telling the story through the prism usually of the survivors. But if you really want to tell the stories of the Holocaust, you have to tell through the stories of the victims. And Primo Levi said it as well, in The Drowned and the Saved. Primo Levi said, only those, he said it from his experience in Auschwitz, but he said only those who were murdered in the gas chambers, they are the ones to testify. Who are we to testify? We survived. We are not the representation of the story of the Holocaust. So this is also very important. Now, I know that my time is up. And so I want to conclude with two short things. We spoke about the numbers, so you can see here the numbers in front of you, so I will not repeat them, okay? You can see here what we spoke, that altogether we are speaking of only 120,000 survivors in the occupied territories, okay? And while 2.1 million Jews remained in the Soviet Union altogether by the end of the war, which break down to approximately 120,000 survivors from the Romanian and Nazi rule, 300,000 soldiers, and between 1.2 to 1.4 million who evacuated or fled, and 700,000 which were never occupied. But what is also important to say here, and this is the last sentence here, is that we have to remember, maybe the war ends, but Soviet Jews are prohibited to leave the Soviet Union. And so World War II ends, but the Cold War starts, and the Iron Curtain comes down. And this is also maybe the reason why for many years we never knew of these stories, because the survivors were in those territories. So you had a very small wave of people who managed to leave the Soviet Union in the 70s and arrive to Israel and maybe to other places as well. A very small wave. But only with the fall of and the break of the dismantling of the communist bloc in 1989, suddenly new narrations came out. But till today, ask people who liberated Auschwitz, usually they will say the Americans. The most important front is the Eastern Front in the overcoming of Nazi Germany in World War II. The Western world in that aspect, you find them only from D-Day, from June 6, 1944, really present. And if you remember the race of who will liberate Berlin and end the war, the Soviets are there on May 2nd, right? And they're the ones who push the Germans throughout the all Eastern air territories up to Germany. And this is something that we have to remember and we have to stress. And because I promised, right, that we're going to speak about the quote of the lecture, so I'm going to come to this and then I'll stop for questions. And if we'll have time, we'll come back to one more thing, okay? And if not, so I'll leave you hanging for maybe curiosity for the future. The quote of this lecture was taken from this letter. And I want to, again, explain the context. Ilya Ehrenburg was a very important Soviet Jew. He was a publicist, a writer. He was very close to Stalin in times, and he was the head of the anti-fascist committee during World War II. Because he was a known figure, many Jews saw him as a person that they can address, even if they didn't know him, even though they didn't know him personally, but that he can provide some answer, some guidance. And many Jewish soldiers write to him. There was even a book published in Russian with all of those letters. And this is one of those letters, and I'd like to read with you, because it might sound also that if you fought in the Soviet army as a Jew, it was a luxury. So even to put that with a question mark, here's the letter. And this is the letter by Yaakov Chizik. I'm a Jew, a student. My nation has 1,000 years history. For thousands of years, our exiled nation from its country suffered from persecutions and humiliations. We, who gave the world the Torah, Christianity, Marx, our ideas which improved the whole human world, we were always called dirty Žid. There's nothing more tragic than my people's fate. From the other side of the front, we were killed and burned. Babi Yar, Majdanek, Auschwitz, 7 million murdered Jews. We didn't face the question for whom to fight in this battle. We couldn't take comfort that other nations' blood will calm the beast and will save us. We knew that the Germans' victory is our death. We fought merciless of those whose fate has been sentenced. But also on this side of the front, among our lines, we weren't people, but Zhidji. To be persecuted by the enemy is very difficult. But when these are your friends, it's beyond the human abilities. It is loneliness. This is the fate of our people. So with these words, I'm going to stop, and then I'll stop the share. And if you have questions, please.
Orit.
And I hope the translation managed to keep pace with me.
Orit, wow. Siempre que te escucho aprendo cosas, pero realmente lo resumiste de una manera que, a pesar de lo complejo que es, se puede entender las diferentes aspectos que están inmersos en toda esta cuestión. Y creo que esto es muy importante para todos los que nos están escuchando y para nuestros graduados también de Moré y Morim, que siempre quieren aprender más y quieren profundizar más, y que es un tema que muy poco lo tocamos, y así aprovecho también para agradecer al doctor Yossi Goldstein, que está con nosotros, que con Yossi, que vos también lo conocés, Orit, él siempre nos da las clases de historia y siempre profundizamos en temas nuevos, y este es otro tema más que vos nos das, que realmente nos complejiza mucho más, y como siempre decimos nosotros en los seminarios, cuanto más aprendemos de Shoah, menos entendemos. Y creo que nos dan más ganas de seguir y de seguir avanzando, y lindo ver a todos acá que están acá atentos y escuchando y anotando. Para mí es un placer. Los invito a que nos escriban las preguntas. Mientras ahorita hago una primera pregunta. Nosotros, los que estamos acá, el proyecto Moré y Morim, somos todos educadores. Y la pregunta es, ¿cómo hacemos para bajar esto a la práctica? ¿Cómo hacemos para enseñar esto en el aula? ¿Qué herramientas tenemos y qué nos recomendás vos?
So this is one of the things that we have been working a lot in the last years. And I think I stressed here a few of the challenges during my presentation. I think the best way to illustrate is to use the testimonies of people and through the personal stories to bring out the history. Yad Vashem in the last years has produced, as part of education and testimonies, this project of interviewing survivors before it's going to be too late, and created altogether approximately 35 films. Among those films, there are 5 films which illustrate this specific topic. You have a story of Simeon Rosenfeld, which is an amazing story because he was in Minsk. He was a Soviet Jewish soldier who was in a POW camp and was sent from Minsk to Sobibor and participated in the uprising of Sobibor, only to flee to the forest, join the partisans, and rejoin the Soviet army to fight to liberate Berlin. Okay, so this is one story, which is an amazing story, and he passed away 2 years ago, and the film was made a year before. And you know, this is the amazing thing with this project, that we're actually too late to do it, but we're still catching people in their last moments when they're in their 90s to document their stories in an educational way. This is something very important because the film is 1 hour. You have also the story of Fania Brodzewski, who still today lives in Vilnius. She's only 98 years old. She still runs the Jewish library in Yiddish in the city. She still testifies. So, and she was among the underground movement in Vilnius ghetto, and then with Abba Kovner and with the partisans in the forest. And she chose to remain in Vilnius after the war until today, which is also important because usually the stories which are brought are people who either immigrate to other places or to Israel. And this is to represent also the choice of many to remain where they lived before, because this is their home, right? Which is another maybe educational challenge of when we choose the stories. And there are other stories like Felix Sorin, and we have also another story from Odessa, which bring us all these stories. Each story highlights a different aspect. So using the personal stories, which are already constructed, we can illustrate and pass better the message to our students. Now, what we have to be careful, I think, this is the challenge. Many times they are not interested because this is an unknown issue. And maybe the way to lure them in, and this is what I tried to do here, hopefully successful, is like when I took here, it's an introduction, the story of the Karas family, 5 testimony pages, and what do we learn from them? Let's take a moment and look into these pages and which information can we draw from them and what does it mean? And then to put it in the historical context. So maybe these are ways that can enable us better to mediate this to young audiences as well in an educational way.
Exactamente, como decís vos, el tema de reconstruir los rostros, y como empezaste con los DAPEYED, con las hojas de testimonio, es una manera también activa de que los estudiantes sean activos y ellos investiguen, y no que reciban todo al principio, sino que se interesen. Hay varios comentarios. Javier nos dice que es una excelente conferencia, que es una historia que de a poco sale a la luz, y es importante saber la causa, como lo expusiste también en forma excelente. Y una pregunta de Jordi de Barcelona, que pregunta, ¿cómo se trata o cómo se contempla la actual Rusia con esta parte de su pasado?
I think we have to define clearly what are our goals. You can't do everything. Now, the question, what is your goal? Your goal is to speak about contemporary Russia and Putin, or your goal is to teach about the Holocaust? These are two separate things. If you want to speak about shaping of remembrance, okay, I can understand. But you can speak of shaping of remembrance only after you learn the history of the place. So, you know, and I'm sure this is your experience as well. Whenever we teach, we always ask three questions: why, what, and how, right? This, in a way, helps us to illustrate what we want to achieve in our lesson or in the whole issue of what we want to teach, the whole theme. It's very tempting always to start with the how. But in education, we have to start and to define first clearly to us, why do we want to deal with this topic and what do we want to teach about from this topic? And this is, again, you need to set your goals. And it's very easy to speak about contemporary Russia, but is that your goal?
Yo creo que es un tema que es muy complejo y que tiene que ver con la construcción de la memoria de los diferentes países. Nosotros, Orit, tenés que entender que estamos hablando de países que fueron, que no formaron parte de la Segunda Guerra Mundial o que fueron que pasivos en algún punto. Entonces, desde el punto de vista de los países que vos trabajás, por ejemplo, como Polonia, que vos trabajaste tantos años, y toda la parte de Rusia, Rumania, son países donde ahí pasó la Shoah. Y por lo tanto, desde nuestra perspectiva es más difícil ver ese tema tenemos otros temas, otros problemas, y acá hubo otros problemas también, genocidios, o como llamamos, politicidios en diferentes zonas de Latinoamérica. Pero cuando hablamos de genocidio es distinta la perspectiva de un latinoamericano o un español o un portugués a lo que son los países donde realmente pasó, y eso es parte de lo que con Yehiel siempre trabajamos, que lo vemos desde otra visión. Orit, tengo unos comentarios más, muy buena conferencia, muchas felicitaciones, muy enriquecedora, y dice también que los judíos de la diáspora están muy tocados con los investigadores en Israel, así que te agradece mucho. Otoda Rabá, también en hebreo te han escrito. Tengo acá, muy importante el tema de la personificación de las víctimas, como bien lo mencionaste vos, más allá de los números que son impresionantes, sino también personificar y darles rostro. Esas son las preguntas que por ahora... también tengo un comentario de Andrea Trumper, la dejaste sin palabras. Desde el primer encuentro de las capacitaciones habla de la Operación Barbarossa y esta conferencia dice que realmente les cerró todo, y también los testimonios que nos diste, así que muchísimas gracias. Y Ossi Goldstein también, el doctor Ossi Goldstein nos agradece a Orit y a vos y a Mamá, y es muy importante también como lo que ellos sí investigan, los testimonios de América Latina, que aquellos sobrevivientes que llegaron a América Latina, y algunos de ellos de diferentes partes también de esta zona, como bien contás, y también de otros lados de Europa, así que muchísimas gracias. También saludos de República Checa. Eso es por ahora los comentarios. No sé si querés cerrar con algo más para terminar.
If you can bear with me for another minute, maybe I'll end with the last slide that will give us, apropos, maybe taking us into also issues of remembrance, if that's agreeable by you. So I'll just share screen, and that will be my concluding remark. One second. I'll reshare 1 second, because this is what happens when you go back into the PowerPoint. You lose it. Okay. And what I would like to end with, I'm sure you are all familiar with this photograph. And this photograph was taken by this person that you can see him also over here, Yevgeny Khaldei. Yevgeny Khaldei was a Ukrainian Jew who lost his parents in the pogroms following the Bolshevist Revolution, and his grandmother raised him, and he made from scratch a camera, and he was employed by TASS agency in Moscow. He documented 1,418 days of World War II, from the moment of Operation Barbarossa, from the invasion, till the end of the war. And I'd like to share with you 2 things. If you look at this photo to the right, this is the liberation of Budapest, when the Soviet army arrives to Hungary. And you can see that this couple has a yellow star, because Budapest ghetto existed to the moment of liberation. And this is what he said. When I met this couple in the ghetto, they both panicked. They thought it was a German soldier. I tore from them the yellow badge and told them that the fascists have lost. I spoke in Yiddish and German. And following what happens, if you remember the famous photo from February 1945 in Iwo Jima of the Americans flagging the American flag, Khaldei decided that he will bring with him flags to wave over Berlin. He goes back to Moscow, takes 3 huge tablecloths in the colors of the Soviet flag, has a friend who's a tailor that makes him flags, huge flags, and with them he arrives on May 2nd to Berlin. They were flagged in 3 places. Here is what you can see, the famous photo on the Reichstag, the German parliament, one in the Tempelhof, the airport, and one on the Brandenburg gate. And it was important for him because he understood that photo creates awareness, creates history. And he wanted to show, as a proud Soviet Jew who lost part of his family in the Holocaust, but also as a Soviet Jewish soldier, this thing. And you can see him here at the last photo during Nuremberg trials. And this is Goering, maybe the second most powerful person in the Third Reich. And he always covered his face. He didn't want anyone to photograph him. And Khaldei said it was only appropriate that a Jew will manage to take his photo. And so he bribed the American officers with 2 vodka bottles, and he got the only photo that we have that you can see Goering's face. And this is what he said. He was, by the way, banned by Stalin later, and he struggled. He was really starving under the Soviet rule later on, till the fall of communism. He passed away in the late 90s. But this is what he said, and this will be my final quote. Hitler would never have dreamt that 2 Jewish photographers, one American and one Soviet, because the one who photographed in Iwo Jima was an American Jew. One American, one Soviet will be the ones who will document the victory. This was the revenge of 2 Jews. So this is my ending quote, and thank you very much. And I hope this will be also useful for you. And thank you for having me here.
Muy esclarecedora la explicación para entender la integración de los judíos en el mundo soviético, los archivos de investigación y la claridad con la que diserta Orit. Sinceras gracias por esta clase magistral. Es muy importante, vemos en la pantalla cómo están aplaudiendo, siguen los agradecimientos. Es muy importante para nosotras contar con su opinión sobre cómo fue la experiencia del encuentro. Es por eso que les pedimos que completen la encuesta que Denise está compartiendo en el chat. Así podemos tener más devoluciones para tenerlas en cuenta para futuros encuentros. Desde la Fundación BAMA agradecemos a Orit Margaliot, directora del Departamento de Guías de la Escuela Internacional para el Estudio del Holocausto de Yad Vashem, y nuevamente al equipo profesional de Yad Vashem, Eliana Rapp-Badiji y Yehiel Chilevsky, por los conocimientos brindados en todos sus espacios de formación. A la Claims Conference, por la confianza depositada en nuestros espacios. Les contamos que los egresados de nuestro programa Morei Morim contarán con las siguientes capacitaciones sobre materiales educativos de Yad Vashem. Son 4 martes, el 12 de octubre a las 16:30 horas, a cargo de Eliana Rapp-Badiji, un calendario de vida, la historia de Tzvi Hershel. El 19 de octubre, también martes, 16:30 horas, a cargo de Eliana, la historia a través de una película animada, la historia de Simcha Holzberg. El 26 de octubre, 16:30 horas, Yehiel Chilevsky, un calendario de vida, la historia de Tzvi Hershel. El martes 2 de noviembre, 16:30 horas, también Yehiel, la historia a través de una película animada, la historia de Simcha Holzberg. Les agradecemos a todos por haber participado de este encuentro, y le paso ahora la palabra a Jimena Jakubovich, directora de la Fundación BAMA.
Bueno, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos, según los lugares donde nos encuentran. Últimas palabras finales. En primer lugar, agradecer desde el inicio, Gaby Glassman, tu presencia, tu participación, dándonos un poco del contexto actual, de por qué siempre se vuelve relevante y siempre es necesario seguir comprendiendo más y mejor acerca de la Shoah, y sobre todo seguir educando en estos temas. Así que muchas gracias, Gaby, muchas gracias, Sohnut, en tu representación. Por supuesto, el trabajo conjunto con Yad Vashem y el apoyo constante de Claims para la realización de nuestros programas. Si pasamos un slide para atrás, vamos a comunicar lo que se viene en estos días y lo que sucederá, y verán por redes, verán por correo electrónico, verán en nuestra página. Morei Morim, a propósito de lo que decíamos recién, abre su convocatoria 2022 para todos los educadores que se quieran formar en la enseñanza de la Shoah. Estará abierta en esta semana la convocatoria, así que manténganse alertas, compartan con colegas, porque es una oportunidad única para formarse en profundidad sobre estos temas y seguir trabajando y formando a más docentes para que formen a más jóvenes y seguir trabajando en estos temas que tanto nos competen. Quiero agradecerles a todos por su participación. Ahorita ha sido un lujo escucharte y que abras estos temas para nosotros, temas que están tal vez explorados en menor profundidad, y que nos abre la posibilidad desde el texto, desde los testimonios, desde las fotografías, desde los mapas, a entender su contexto. Desde ahí es donde es la propuesta de este ciclo, de abrir a partir de distintos textos a entender en profundidad y a seguir estudiando estos temas que a todos nos interesan. Van a tener disponible esta conferencia en YouTube, en nuestra página web, perdón, en nuestra página de YouTube de BAMA en los próximos días, así que van a poder revisitarla, compartirla, utilizarla para sus clases, citarla a Orit y demás. Así que Eliana, Yehiel, muchísimas gracias también. Leticia, Barán, Valeria Levin, Denise Hoffman del equipo de Fundación BAMA, muchísimas gracias por todo el trabajo para llevar adelante este ciclo. Y bueno, como han visto, tenemos mucho por delante, nuevas actividades en las que seguimos trabajando, así que los esperamos, estamos muy cerca y seguiremos por aquí. Muchísimas gracias a todos por participar.